massive, permanent? What if everything you were taught about one of the most famous monuments on Earth is wrong? What if the silent stone guardian watching the horizon for thousands of years is not just a relic of ancient Egypt, but a message from a forgotten world? A world that existed long before the first pharaoh ever claimed the throne. Long before history itself, as we know it, even began. And what if the evidence has been there all along, carved into the stone, hidden in the stars, buried beneath the sand, waiting for someone willing to question the story? Tonight, we are going to explore 6 unexplainable pieces of evidence that suggest something radical, something deeply unsettling, that the Great Sphinx of Giza may be thousands of years older than we've been told. Older, not by centuries, but by entire epochs. So before we begin, take a moment. Slow down. Let your mind open just a little. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a challenge to everything we think we know about human civilization. If you enjoy questioning the official narrative, if you're drawn to mysteries that don't have easy answers, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read them, and they matter more than you think. Now, let's begin at the surface. The Great Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau, just outside modern Cairo. A colossal figure carved directly from limestone bedrock, a lion's body stretched across the desert floor, and a human face staring eternally toward the rising sun. According to mainstream Egyptology, the Sphinx was built around 2500 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. It is said to represent his power, his divinity, his connection to the gods. A guardian of the pyramids, a symbol of royal authority. This is the version taught in schools, printed in textbooks, repeated by guides, documentaries, and scholars alike. Simple, clean, settled. But here's the problem. Almost none of that is actually proven. There is no inscription anywhere on the Sphinx itself that names Khafre as its builder. No construction records, no detailed accounts from the time describing its creation. The primary piece of evidence used to support this theory is a damaged stone slab known as the Dream Stele, placed between the Sphinx's paws over 1,000 years after its supposed construction. And even that inscription is incomplete, eroded, and open to interpretation. Think about that for a second. One of the largest and most iconic monuments on Earth, and we don't actually know who built it. But that's just the beginning, because when scientists, engineers, and independent researchers started looking closer, not at the stories, but at the stone itself, they began to notice something strange, something that didn't fit. Patterns carved into the body of the Sphinx that didn't match wind, didn't match sand, didn't match the desert environment it has supposedly existed in for 4,500 years. Patterns that looked like something else entirely, something older, something that shouldn't be there at all. And that's where the first crack appears in the official timeline, because if those patterns are what some experts believe they are, then the Sphinx wasn't built in a dry desert. It was built in a time when this land looked completely different. A time of rain, a time of rivers, a time that, according to conventional history, should not have included any civilization capable of building something like this. And yet, the stone doesn't lie. If you were standing in front of the Sphinx for the first time, you might not notice it immediately. At first glance, everything looks exactly as you'd expect. Weathered stone, sand, the marks of time slowly eating away at the surface. But the longer you look, the more something begins to feel off. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to make you pause, because the erosion on the body of the Sphinx doesn't look like the erosion on anything else around it. And that's where the real investigation begins. You see, on the Giza Plateau, erosion follows a very predictable pattern. The desert is dominated by wind and sand. Over thousands of years, sandstorms act like sandpaper, grinding against stone surfaces. This creates horizontal erosion lines, long, shallow grooves that run parallel to the ground. You can see this clearly on nearby structures, the pyramids, the surrounding temples, even natural rock formations in the area. They all tell the same story. Wind, sand, time. But the Sphinx tells a different one. Instead of horizontal lines, its body is covered in deep vertical channels, rounded grooves, undulating patterns that look almost like waves frozen in stone. These are not the marks of sand. They are the marks of water, and not just any water, not occasional rain, not brief storms, but prolonged, heavy rainfall over long periods of time. The kind of rainfall that slowly eats into limestone, carving deep, vertical fissures as water runs downward, again and again, year after year. This type of erosion is well understood in geology. It has a signature, a pattern, and that exact pattern appears on the Sphinx. Now here's where things get uncomfortable, because the Giza Plateau hasn't experienced that kind of rainfall in a very, very long time. Today, it's part of one of the driest regions on Earth. Rain is rare. Sometimes years pass without any significant precipitation. Even thousands of years ago, during the time of the pharaohs, Egypt was already a desert. So the question becomes unavoidable. When did it rain enough to create those marks? Geologists have an answer, and it doesn't match the history books. The last time this region experienced sustained, heavy rainfall was during a period known as the African Humid Period, sometimes called the Green Sahara, a time when this entire region was not desert, but a vast landscape of grasslands, lakes, and rivers. Animals roamed freely. Early human communities thrived. And most importantly, rain fell. Frequently, heavily, for thousands of years. This period ended roughly between 7,000 and 5,000 BCE. Let that sink in. That's at least 2,000 years before the accepted construction date of the Sphinx, and possibly much more. Which leads to a simple, but devastating implication. If the erosion on the Sphinx was caused by rainfall, then the Sphinx must have already existed during that wet period. Not after. Before. This is not speculation. It's not mythology. It's not interpretation of ancient texts. It's physical evidence, carved into the stone itself. And stone doesn't care about our timelines. It records what actually happened. Of course, this idea didn't go unchallenged. When geologists first presented these findings, many Egyptologists pushed back immediately. Alternative explanations were proposed. Maybe it was groundwater rising from below. Maybe it was chemical weathering. Maybe it was even morning dew accumulating over time. But each of these explanations has a problem. They don't produce vertical erosion patterns. Water rising from the ground doesn't carve downward channels. Dew doesn't create deep grooves in solid rock. And chemical weathering doesn't selectively create patterns that mimic rainfall erosion so precisely. Even more puzzling, if these alternative explanations were correct, then why don't we see the same erosion patterns on nearby structures made from the same limestone? Why is the Sphinx different? Why does it alone carry the signature of a climate that shouldn't have existed during its supposed construction? The more you look at it, the harder it becomes to ignore. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because this isn't just about erosion, it's about time. And the possibility that the timeline we've been given is missing something massive. Something buried not just under sand, but under thousands of years of assumptions. Now imagine this. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the Giza Plateau not as a desert, but as something entirely different. Green, alive. Water moving across the land. Rivers cutting through soft earth. Rain falling again and again over generations. Grasslands stretching beyond the horizon. Herds of animals moving through the open terrain. Early human communities living in a world that feels nothing like the Egypt we know today. This wasn't a fantasy. This was real. Geological and climate data confirm that North Africa once went through a dramatic transformation. What we now call the Sahara Desert was once a thriving ecosystem, filled with lakes, vegetation, and life. This period, the African humid period, lasted for thousands of years. And during that time, the kind of rainfall needed to carve deep erosion patterns into limestone was not only possible, it was constant. Now hold that image. Because if the Sphinx shows clear signs of having been shaped by that kind of rainfall, then it must have already been standing there, exposed to the elements, while this green world still existed. Which means it wasn't built in the desert. It witnessed the desert being born. Think about the implications of that. The Sphinx didn't just survive time. It survived a complete transformation of the environment around it, from fertile land to one of the harshest deserts on Earth. And it still stands, silent, watching. But here's where the mystery deepens even further. Because when scientists began analyzing not just the erosion, but the geological layers of the rock itself, they noticed something else. The Sphinx wasn't built using blocks, like the pyramids. It was carved directly out of the bedrock, layer by layer. And that bedrock tells its own story. The limestone of the Giza Plateau is not uniform. It's made up of different layers, some harder, some softer, each responding differently to erosion. The upper layers, where the head of the Sphinx is carved, are significantly more durable. The lower layers, which form the body, are much softer and more vulnerable to weathering. That alone could explain why the body appears more eroded than the head, but only partially. Because what researchers observed doesn't match a simple difference in material strength. The body of the Sphinx is not just more worn down, it is dramatically more eroded. Deep channels, rounded cavities, surfaces that look almost melted away over time. Meanwhile, the head remains comparatively intact, sharper, more defined, less affected. And this creates a problem. Because if the entire monument was carved at the same time, under the same environmental conditions, the difference in erosion should be noticeable, but not extreme. What we see instead suggests something else, something far more unsettling. that the head and the body may not be the same age. Let that sink in, because this leads to a controversial but powerful theory. What if the Sphinx originally had a different head? A larger one, a more proportionate one, possibly the head of a lion. Over time, exposed to thousands of years of rain, that original head could have been heavily eroded, damaged beyond recognition. And then, much later, during the time of the pharaohs, it was recarved, reshaped into a human face. Smaller, because there was less material left to work with. Refined, using the tools and artistic style of a later civilization. This would explain everything. Why the head appears too small for the massive body. Why it is less eroded. Why it stylistically resembles known Egyptian faces, while the body tells a much older story. It also aligns with something else we know about ancient Egypt. Pharaohs had a habit of claiming what wasn't originally theirs. They restored monuments, recarved statues, erased names, and replaced them with their own. Not out of deception, but as a display of power. To inherit the past was to control it. So imagine this scenario. A ruler arrives at Giza, thousands of years after the original construction. He sees a massive, ancient monument, weathered, mysterious, already old beyond memory. A relic from a time no one fully understands, and he decides to claim it, to reshape its identity, to place his own face upon it, not creating the Sphinx, but rewriting it. If this is true, then the Sphinx is not just older than we thought. It is layered. A monument built in one age, modified in another, and misunderstood in ours. And we're only 3 pieces in. But what if the answers don't lie on the surface at all? What if the most important part of this mystery is hidden beneath the Sphinx, where no one is allowed to look? Because while geologists were studying the erosion, another group of researchers was doing something very different. They weren't looking at the stone, they were listening to it. In the early 1990s, a series of seismic studies were conducted around the Sphinx. The goal was simple: to understand what lies beneath the surface without disturbing the monument itself. The method works by sending vibrations into the ground and analyzing how those waves reflect back. Different materials respond differently. Solid rock, empty space, compacted soil, each leaves a unique signature. It's like mapping an invisible world. And what they found was unexpected. Beneath the Sphinx, directly under its front paws, the instruments detected a large anomaly. A void. A space that shouldn't be there. Not random. Not irregular. But structured. Roughly rectangular in shape, estimated to be several meters wide and several meters deep. Too precise to be natural. Too clean to be accidental. A chamber. Or something very much like one. Let that settle in your mind, because this is where the story takes a turn, from strange to deeply unsettling. No official excavation has ever been allowed in that exact location, despite the technology confirming the anomaly, despite decades of speculation, despite the fact that, if true, this could be one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history. Nothing. No digging. No full investigation. Just silence. And that raises a question that's hard to ignore. Why? Why detect something and then refuse to look closer? Officially, the reason is preservation. The Sphinx is fragile. Any excavation could risk damaging the structure, And that concern is valid. But it's not the whole story. Because smaller, less invasive techniques exist. Techniques that have been used in other ancient sites to explore hidden chambers without causing harm. So again, why not here? To understand why this matters, you need to go beyond modern science and step into ancient legend. Because long before seismic equipment, long before modern archaeology, there were stories. Stories about something hidden beneath the Sphinx. Ancient Egyptian traditions speak of a place sometimes referred to as the Hall of Records, a hidden chamber containing knowledge from a lost civilization. Records of a time before Egypt, before dynasties, before recorded history. A place where knowledge was preserved, in anticipation of a future when humanity would be ready to rediscover it. Now, you don't have to believe that. You can treat it as myth, symbolism, storytelling. But here's where things get interesting. These legends don't exist in isolation. Across different cultures, across different regions of the world, we find echoes of the same idea. Lost knowledge, hidden chambers, ancient civilizations that came before, civilizations that disappeared, but left something behind. And then, thousands of years later, modern instruments detect a chamber, exactly where the stories said it would be. Coincidence? Maybe, but it's a very specific coincidence, and it forces us to consider something uncomfortable. That ancient myths might not be entirely fictional. That they might be distorted memories of real events, passed down, reshaped, but rooted in truth. Now imagine for a moment that beneath the Sphinx, there really is something. Not treasure, not gold, but information, records, evidence of a civilization that existed before the timeline we accept today. A civilization capable of carving the Sphinx, aligning it with the stars, and building structures that still defy full explanation. If something like that were discovered, it wouldn't just rewrite history, it would break it. Because it would mean that everything we think we know about the origins of civilization is incomplete, and that we are not the first. Not the first to build. Not the first to understand the sky. Not the first to reach a level of knowledge we consider advanced. And maybe not the first to lose it. So the question becomes, is the silence about preservation? Or is it about something else entirely? Something that challenges not just history, but identity. And we're still not done. Because even if you ignore the erosion, even if you dismiss the chamber, there's another layer to this mystery. One that isn't buried in the ground, but written in the stars. Look up, not at the Sphinx, not at the desert, but beyond it. Because sometimes, the oldest clues aren't carved in stone. They're written in the sky. For thousands of years, ancient civilizations didn't just observe the stars. They studied them with precision. They tracked their movements. They mapped patterns. They aligned monuments with celestial events. And Egypt was no exception. In fact, many of its most important structures are carefully aligned with astronomical phenomena. The pyramids, the temples, even entire cities. Nothing was random. Everything had meaning. And the Sphinx may be one of the most precise markers of all. You see, the Sphinx is positioned facing directly east, not approximately. Not symbolically. Precisely. It looks toward the exact point on the horizon where the sun rises during the equinoxes, those 2 moments each year when day and night are perfectly balanced. This alone is remarkable. But it's not the real mystery, because the equinox isn't just about the sun. It's also tied to something much larger, a slow, almost imperceptible motion of the Earth itself, known as axial precession. Imagine the Earth like a spinning top. As it spins, its axis slowly wobbles, tracing a circle in the sky over a period of about 26,000 years. This movement causes the background of stars behind the rising sun during the equinox to change over time. In other words, the constellation that appears on the horizon at sunrise during the equinox is different depending on the era. This is how ancient astronomers defined ages: the age of Taurus, the age of Aries, the age of Pisces, and so on, each lasting roughly 2,160 years. Now here's the question. If a civilization were to build a monument aligned with the equinox sunrise, and if that monument had symbolic meaning tied to a specific constellation, then which age would it represent? Let's go back to the official timeline. Around 2500 BCE, when the Sphinx is said to have been built, the sun, during the spring equinox, rose in the constellation of Taurus, the bull, and that's important, because the bull was one of the most significant sacred symbols in ancient Egypt. The Apis bull, a central figure in Egyptian religion. If the Sphinx was built during that time, as a symbolic celestial marker, then logically, it should reflect the age of Taurus, a bull. But it doesn't. The Sphinx is not a bull, it's a lion. And that changes everything. Because the age of Leo, the time when the sun rose in the constellation of Leo during the spring equinox, dates back much further, approximately between 10,500 BCE and 8,500 BCE. Let that settle in. That's more than 12,000 years ago. Right in the same time frame suggested by the geological evidence. Now imagine this scene. The sun begins to rise on the day of the spring equinox. The horizon glows, and just before the sun breaks through, the constellation of Leo appears, directly in front of the Sphinx. A lion on Earth, facing a lion in the sky, perfectly aligned, perfectly symbolic, a marker not just of space, but of time. This is not a random coincidence. At least, that's what some researchers argue. Because when you combine this with something else, the picture becomes even more precise. The layout of the 3 main pyramids at Giza, when viewed from above, their positions closely match the 3 stars of Orion's belt, a pattern that has been studied, debated, and modeled using astronomical software. And here's the key detail. That alignment is not perfect for 2500 BCE, but it becomes significantly more accurate if you go back to around 10,500 BCE, the same period. Again, 2 independent lines of evidence, geology, astronomy, pointing to the same window in time, separated by completely different methods, yet converging on one conclusion. And at some point, coincidence stops being a comfortable explanation, because now you're not looking at one anomaly. You're looking at a pattern that suggests intention, design, knowledge. But here's the question no one can easily answer. Who? had that knowledge 12,000 years ago. Because according to everything we're taught, civilization didn't exist yet. No cities, no writing, no advanced astronomy, just small groups of hunter-gatherers trying to survive. And yet, something, or someone, may have been watching the stars, understanding cycles, and carving that knowledge into the earth itself. If that's true, then the Sphinx is not just a statue. It's a timestamp, a message, locked to a specific moment in deep time. And we're only halfway through the evidence. By now, a pattern is starting to form. Not a clear answer, but something more dangerous. Doubt. Because each new piece of evidence doesn't just add information, it removes certainty. And the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to return to the version of history we started with. So let's step away from the sky and come back to the ground, to something far more physical, something measurable, something that doesn't rely on interpretation, but on direct comparison. Because there's another clue, hidden not in what the Sphinx is, but in what surrounds it. The enclosure. If you've ever seen images of the Sphinx from above, you'll notice that it sits inside a large, carved-out trench, a kind of rectangular basin, cut directly into the bedrock. This enclosure wasn't built. It was excavated. The stone removed from this trench was not discarded. It was used, specifically, to build nearby structures, including what is known as the Sphinx Temple. Now here's where things get interesting, because those massive limestone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, match perfectly with the layers of rock removed from the Sphinx enclosure. Same composition, same geological sequence, same origin. In other words, the temple and the Sphinx are directly connected, built from the same stone at the same time. Or at least, that's what the official narrative suggests. But when researchers examined those temple blocks more closely, they found something unexpected. The same erosion patterns, rounded edges, vertical weathering, signs of prolonged exposure to water. But here's the contradiction. Those blocks are part of a constructed building. They were cut, moved, and assembled, which means the erosion must have happened before they were placed. Let that sink in, because it creates a timeline problem. If the Sphinx and its enclosure were carved during the time of Khafra, then the blocks would have been immediately used to build the temple. They wouldn't have had time to sit exposed for thousands of years, under heavy rainfall, developing deep erosion patterns before being assembled. And yet, that's exactly what the stone suggests, which leads to a disturbing possibility, that the stone blocks were cut, then left exposed for a very long time, before being reused, reclaimed, reassembled by a later civilization. In other words, the temple may not have been built at the same time as the Sphinx. It may have been built much later, using much older materials. And if that's true, then the Sphinx itself must be older still. Now think about what that implies. A structure carved into the earth, left standing, weathered by a completely different climate, then rediscovered and partially repurposed by a civilization that came long after its creation. This isn't speculation. This is what the physical evidence suggests, and it fits a pattern we've seen before. Throughout history, Civilizations build on top of the ruins of those that came before. They reuse materials. They reinterpret meaning. They inherit without fully understanding. So, imagine ancient Egypt not as the beginning, but as a continuation, a culture that found something already there, something ancient, something powerful, and chose to make it their own. That would explain why the Sphinx appears in their mythology, but not in their construction records. Why it's revered, but not clearly attributed. Why it feels, even within Egyptian culture, like something older, something inherited. And this brings us to the sixth and final piece of evidence. Not in stone, not in the stars, but in something far more fragile. Human memory. Because sometimes, the past doesn't survive in monuments, it survives in stories. Long before history was written, before ink touched papyrus, before names were carved into stone, there were stories, passed from voice to voice, from one generation to the next, changed, reshaped, sometimes distorted, but never completely lost. Because memory has a strange way of surviving, even when everything else disappears. Ancient Egypt was no exception. Despite being one of the most advanced civilizations of its time, it still carried myths that spoke of something older, something that came before them. One of the names given to the Sphinx in ancient texts is Horem-Akhet, Horus of the horizon, a being tied to the rising sun, to cycles, to beginnings. But there is another, lesser-known name, Shesep-Ankh, often translated as the living image. Now think about that. Not a statue, not a monument, a living image, an embodiment of something. But of what? The texts don't say. Or perhaps they assumed it was already known. Because in some traditions, the Sphinx was not seen as something created by humans at all, but as something inherited, something ancient, even to them. And when we look beyond Egypt, we begin to see something even more intriguing. Because the idea of a Sphinx, a creature with the body of a lion and the head of a human or god, is not unique. It appears again and again across completely different cultures. In ancient Mesopotamia, there were the Lamassu, guardians with human heads and powerful animal bodies. In Greece, the Sphinx appears as a riddling entity, ancient and dangerous, guarding forbidden knowledge. In Persia, in India, in Anatolia, variations of the same form emerge, different names, different interpretations, but the same core idea. A hybrid guardian, a threshold being, something that stands between worlds. Now ask yourself, how does the same symbol appear across civilizations? Separated by geography, language, and time. The traditional explanation is cultural diffusion. That one civilization influenced another. That ideas spread through trade, migration, and contact. And sometimes, that's true. But not always. Because some of these cultures developed independently, with no clear line of connection. And yet, the archetype remains, which raises a deeper possibility that these cultures weren't copying each other. They were remembering something, a shared origin, a shared symbol, passed down from a time before recorded history, a time when the Sphinx, or something like it, already existed. And then there are the legends, The ones that don't fit neatly into academic frameworks. The ones often dismissed as myth. Stories recorded by ancient historians, travelers, and scholars. One such figure was al-Masudi, a 10th century Arab historian who wrote about Egypt's past. He described the Sphinx not as a monument of the pharaohs, but as something far older, something that existed before a great flood. According to these accounts, the Sphinx was built by a civilization that came before Egypt, a civilization that understood a coming catastrophe and attempted to preserve its knowledge, not in books, not in fragile materials, but in stone, in structures designed to survive time itself, and more importantly, in hidden places, underground chambers, sealed spaces, where records, artifacts, and knowledge could remain untouched. Waiting. Now you can dismiss these stories. You can say they are exaggerations, legends, misinterpretations of older texts. But here's the problem. They echo something we've already seen. The chamber beneath the Sphinx, detected, but never explored. The erosion suggesting immense age, the astronomical alignment pointing to deep time, the missing construction records, the reused materials. Individually, each of these can be questioned, but together, they begin to reinforce something, a possibility that the Sphinx is not a product of ancient Egypt, but a relic of something far older, something that Egypt itself inherited and tried to understand, just like we are. Because maybe we're not discovering the truth for the first time. Maybe we're rediscovering it, piece by piece, from fragments left behind. And if that's the case, then the Sphinx is not just a mystery. It's a survivor from a world that no longer exists. And we're getting closer to the moment where all of this comes together. At this point, it would be easy to stop, to say that the evidence is interesting, but inconclusive, to file it away as another mystery, another unanswered question buried in the sands of time. But there's one more detail, one that is often overlooked, not because it's hidden, but because it's too obvious, too simple. And sometimes, the simplest questions are the most dangerous. Why is there no record of the Sphinx being built? Think about that carefully. Ancient Egypt was obsessed with legacy. Pharaohs carved their names into stone. They documented their achievements, their victories, their monuments. The pyramids? Documented. Temples? Documented. Even minor structures often carry inscriptions, names of architects, records of dedication. But the Sphinx? Nothing. No inscription from the old kingdom saying, "I built this." No celebration. No detailed account of its construction. Just silence. The first known references to the Sphinx appear much later, during the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after its supposed creation. And even then, it is not described as something new, not as a recent achievement, but as something ancient, something already buried in sand, already mysterious, already forgotten. The dream stele of Thutmose IV tells us that when he encountered the Sphinx, it was almost completely covered. Only the head visible above the desert. He slept in its shadow, and in a dream, the Sphinx spoke to him, promised him kingship if he would clear the sand, which he did. But notice what's missing. Even then, no mention of who built it, no origin story, just reverence. and mystery. Now ask yourself, how does a civilization forget the origin of its greatest monument? Not a small statue, not a damaged ruin, but a massive, unmistakable structure. Visible for miles. That doesn't just disappear. It stands. It dominates the landscape. It demands attention. And yet, its origin is unknown. That doesn't happen in a few centuries. That doesn't even happen in 1,000 years. In a culture that preserved its past so carefully. That happens over much longer spans of time. Enough time for memory to fade, for stories to change, for truth to become myth, and myth to become silence. This is the sixth piece of evidence, not physical, not astronomical, but historical, or rather, the absence of history. Because sometimes, what isn't recorded is just as important as what is. And when you combine this with everything we've seen, the erosion, the climate, the stars, the structure, the chamber, the myths, a picture begins to emerge. Not a complete one, but a powerful one. A monument, built in a time before Egypt, weathered by a climate that no longer exists, aligned with a sky from a different age, modified by a later civilization, remembered only in fragments, and still standing, still watching, still waiting. The Great Sphinx is not just a statue, it's a question, carved in stone. And the deeper you look, the more that question grows. Because if this is true, if even part of this is true, then we are not looking at the beginning of civilization. We are looking at the aftermath of something that came before. And that changes everything. But to truly understand what that means, we need to step back and see the full picture. All 6 pieces. Together. Now let's bring everything together. Not as separate ideas. Not as isolated anomalies. But as one connected picture. Because individually, each piece of evidence can be questioned, challenged, explained away. But when you place them side by side, they begin to reinforce each other. And that's where things become difficult to ignore. Let's start with the first, the erosion. Deep vertical channels carved into the body of the Sphinx, matching the unmistakable signature of prolonged rainfall. Not wind, not sand, but water, falling from above, over long periods of time. A type of erosion that could only have formed during a climate that no longer exists in Egypt. A climate that ended at least 7,000 years ago. Second, the climate itself, the Green Sahara. A time when this region was not desert, but alive. When rain was not rare, but constant. When lakes, rivers, and vegetation covered the land. And if the Sphinx was exposed to that environment, it must already have existed during that time. Third, the stars. The precise alignment of the Sphinx toward the equinox sunrise. The symbolism of its lion form. And the astronomical reality that the age of Leo, the only time when a lion-facing monument would perfectly align with the rising constellation of Leo, occurred around 10,500 BCE, not during the time of the pharaohs, but thousands of years earlier. Fourth, the structure itself, the disproportion between the head and the body, the possibility that the head was recarved in a later era, explaining why it appears less eroded, why it looks stylistically Egyptian, while the body tells a different story. An older one. Fifth, the enclosure in the temple. Stone blocks cut from the Sphinx's surroundings, showing signs of erosion that must have occurred before they were used in construction, suggesting that the materials were already ancient by the time they were assembled. And finally, the sixth piece, the silence. No construction records, no inscriptions, no origin story, only later references, describing the Sphinx as something already ancient, already mysterious, already forgotten. 6 independent lines of evidence: geology, climate, astronomy, architecture, engineering, history, all pointing, not in different directions, but toward the same conclusion, that the Sphinx is older, much older. Now take a step back. Imagine what that really means. Not just for Egypt, but for everything. Because if the Sphinx was built 10,000 or even 12,000 years ago, then someone was capable of creating it. A structure of that scale, that precision, that intention, at a time when, according to everything we've been taught, no such civilization existed, no cities, no advanced tools, no complex knowledge systems. And yet, something was there, something capable, something organized, something aware of the sky, the earth, and time itself. And then, something happened. Because if that civilization existed, it didn't continue. It didn't evolve into Egypt. It didn't leave behind a clear line of development. It disappeared, almost completely, leaving behind fragments, monuments, hints, enough to question, but not enough to fully understand. And that brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all, that human history is not a straight line, but a cycle, that civilizations rise, reach incredible heights, and then fall, erased by time, by climate, by catastrophe, only for new ones to emerge, on top of what remains, forgetting what came before, repeating the pattern, again and again. If that's true, then the Sphinx is not just a relic, it's a warning, a message carved into stone, from a world that came before ours, a world that may have believed that something was coming, something inevitable, something powerful enough to erase everything, except the things carved in rock. And now, you're standing in front of it, looking at the same face that has watched the sunrise for thousands upon thousands of years. And maybe, for the first time, you're seeing it not as a statue, but as a survivor. So what happens after a civilization disappears? Not declines, not transforms, but vanishes. Because we tend to imagine collapse as something gradual. Empires fall, cultures fade, knowledge is passed down, even if imperfectly. But history doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it breaks, suddenly, violently, irreversibly. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth was coming out of the last ice age. Glaciers that had covered vast parts of the planet for thousands of years began to melt. Sea levels rose, coastlines shifted, entire regions were swallowed by water. But it wasn't just a slow process. There is growing evidence that this transition included sudden, catastrophic events, massive floods, rapid climate shifts, ecosystems collapsing in a matter of generations. One of the most debated events from this period is known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions after the Earth had already begun warming. Temperatures dropped sharply, Weather patterns changed. And then, just as suddenly, it ended. The planet shifted again into a warmer, more stable climate. The one that allowed agriculture, cities, and eventually civilization as we know it to emerge. But here's the key detail. This period of instability aligns almost perfectly with the time frame suggested by the Sphinx evidence, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Now imagine this scenario. A civilization exists during the late Ice Age, not necessarily like ours, not with skyscrapers or digital technology, but advanced in its own way, understanding the sky, working with stone, organized enough to build large-scale structures. And then, the world changes, rapidly, unpredictably. Floods reshape the land, habitats disappear, resources become scarce, population collapses, and whatever knowledge existed is lost. Not because it wasn't important, but because survival comes first, and memory can only carry so much. Now fast forward, thousands of years pass, new cultures emerge, new societies form, people begin again, farming, building, organizing. Eventually, Egypt rises along the Nile, a civilization we recognize, one that leaves records, names, structures. But even they carry stories of something older, a first time, a golden age, a period when gods walked the earth, when knowledge came from somewhere else. And what if those stories are not just symbolic? What if they are echoes, distorted memories of a real past, a past that included a civilization capable of building something like the Sphinx, a civilization that didn't survive, but left behind markers, not to prove they existed, but simply because they built something that could endure. Stone, aligned with the earth, aligned with the sky, resistant to time. Now think about this. If you wanted to leave a message, not for the next generation, but for people living thousands of years in the future, what would you build? Not paper, not digital data, not anything fragile. You would carve it into the earth itself. You would align it with something unchanging, something predictable, like the stars. You would create something so large, so durable, that even if everything else disappeared, it would remain. And maybe that's exactly what the Sphinx is. Not a tomb, not a monument to a ruler, but a marker, a signal, a way of saying we were here, and maybe we knew. Because if there was a civilization before ours, and if it faced a global catastrophe, then the most important question is not whether it existed, but whether they tried to warn us, and whether we're paying attention. But what if the message was never meant to be obvious? What if it wasn't designed to be understood immediately, but to be rediscovered, slowly, piece by piece, over time? Because when you look at the Sphinx, not as a monument, but as a system, something begins to change. It stops being just a structure and starts looking like a combination of signals, geological, astronomical, symbolic, all layered together, all pointing not just to a place, but to a moment, a specific window in deep time, around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Now ask yourself this: why that moment? Why anchor something so massive, so permanent, to that exact point in history? Because if it was intentional, then it wasn't random. It meant something. And that brings us to something rarely discussed. Not evidence, but intention. Because building something like the Sphinx is not just about ability. It's about purpose. It requires planning, vision, a reason strong enough to justify the effort. So what was the reason? If it wasn't a tomb, if it wasn't a ruler's vanity project, if it wasn't even built by the civilization we thought, then what was it for? Let's consider one possibility. Timekeeping. Not in the simple sense. Not tracking days or seasons, but tracking cycles. Long cycles. Astronomical cycles. The kind that take thousands of years to complete. The kind that most civilizations never fully observe, because they don't last long enough. But if you understood those cycles, if you knew that the position of the stars shifts over time, that entire constellations rise and fall on the horizon, depending on the era, then you could mark those changes, not with calendars, but with monuments, aligned. The Sphinx, facing the equinox sunrise, the pyramids, mirroring the stars, together, forming a system, a map, not of space, but of time, a way to encode a date, using the sky itself. And if that's true, then the Sphinx isn't just old, it's precise, built with knowledge that requires long-term observation, generations, maybe even a civilization that existed long enough to understand patterns we are only beginning to rediscover. Now think about how unusual that is, because even today, with all our technology, we rely on recorded data to understand long cycles. We don't observe them directly, we calculate them. But a civilization without modern tools would need time, lots of it, to notice these patterns, to understand them, to use them, and then to encode them into something that would survive. Something like the Sphinx, which leads to another unsettling question. If they understood time on that scale, did they also understand what was coming? Because if you can track long cycles, you might begin to see patterns not just in the sky, but on Earth. Climate cycles, environmental shifts, periodic instability. And if that's the case, then maybe the Sphinx is not just marking a moment in time, but the end of one. The end of a cycle. The end of a world they knew was about to change. And that would explain something else. Why build in stone? Why build something so durable, so resistant, so difficult to destroy? Because if you expect everything else to disappear, you don't build for the present. You build for the future, for someone you will never meet, someone who might stand where you once stood, and try to understand, just like you are now. Because maybe the Sphinx isn't asking a question. Maybe it's answering one, and we just haven't figured out which one yet. Now let's take that idea one step further. Because if the Sphinx is part of a system, then it's not alone. It was never meant to stand by itself. Look around it. The pyramids, the temples, the layout of the entire Giza plateau. At first it seems chaotic. Different structures, different shapes, different purposes. But when you zoom out, when you stop looking at individual buildings and start looking at the pattern, something begins to emerge. Order, alignment, intention. The three main pyramids are not placed randomly. Their positions, their spacing, even their relative sizes, follow a pattern that closely resembles the three stars of Orion's belt. This isn't a vague similarity. It's measurable. precise enough that researchers have been able to overlay star maps onto satellite images and see the match. And just like with the Sphinx, the timing matters. Because the alignment is not perfect for the sky as it looked during the time of the pharaohs. It's close, but not exact. However, if you rewind the sky, if you go back thousands of years, to around 10,500 BCE, the match becomes significantly stronger. The stars align more precisely. The pattern fits better. Again, the same window in time. Now, combine that with the Sphinx, a lion facing the rising sun during the age of Leo, and behind it, the pyramids, mirroring Orion. In ancient Egyptian belief, Orion was associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife, the sky, rebirth, and the Nile, flowing beside the plateau, mirrors the Milky Way. So what do you have? A complete system. Earth, reflecting sky. Stone, reflecting stars. A landscape, designed as a map. But not a map you walk. A map you read. A map that encodes relationships between constellations, between directions, between cycles. Now ask yourself this: is it possible that all of this happened by coincidence? That a lion-shaped monument facing the equinox sunrise just happens to align with the age of Leo, while nearby pyramids just happen to mirror Orion, and the Nile just happens to correspond to the Milky Way, all within the same time window? It's possible, but the probability becomes harder to defend, because patterns like this don't usually appear without intention, and intention implies knowledge, advanced knowledge, not just of construction, but of astronomy, geometry, geography, a level of integration. That requires planning on a scale far beyond a single ruler, or even a single generation. Now think about the effort required, not just to build one structure, but to design an entire landscape based on the sky. This isn't decoration. It's not symbolic art. It's encoding. And encoding requires something very specific. Information. Something you want to preserve. Something you want others to find. But not necessarily understand immediately. Because the complexity itself becomes a filter. Only those who observe carefully, who question, who connect the pieces, will begin to see it. And maybe that's the point. Because if the Sphinx and the pyramids are part of the same system, then they are not just monuments. They are messages, layered, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a mind that's willing to see beyond the surface. And now we're getting close. Because when you combine everything, the erosion, the stars, the structure, the missing history, the myths, the system, you're left with something that no longer fits inside the official narrative. Something that demands a new question. Not, how was the Sphinx built? But, who had the knowledge to design all of this? And more importantly, what happened to them? Let's assume for a moment that all of this is true, not proven, not confirmed, but possible. A civilization existing over 10,000 years ago, capable of observing the sky with precision, capable of shaping stone on a monumental scale, capable of encoding knowledge into architecture itself, and then gone. If that sounds difficult to accept, it should, because it challenges something very deep, not just history, but identity. We are taught that civilization began recently, that progress is linear, that we are the most advanced point in a steady upward climb. But what if that's not the full story? What if progress isn't a straight line, but a pattern? A rise, followed by a fall, followed by another rise? Because when you look at the evidence from the end of the last ice age, you don't just see environmental change. You see disruption, mass extinctions, shifts in human behavior, the sudden appearance of new technologies in places where they weren't expected. Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Massive stone pillars, arranged with precision, dating back over 11,000 years. Built before agriculture was fully established, before cities, before writing. And yet, someone built it. Someone organized it. Someone understood how to shape stone and create something that would last. Just like the Sphinx. Now imagine, these weren't isolated cases, but fragments, survivors, pieces of a much larger puzzle that we haven't fully uncovered yet. Because time doesn't preserve everything equally. Organic materials disappear. Wood decays. Metal corrodes. Even entire cities can vanish, without a trace. But stone, especially when carved from bedrock, endures. Which means, if a civilization existed that long ago, most of what they created is already gone, erased by time. Except for the things they carved into the earth itself, like the Sphinx. Now consider this. If such a civilization existed, and if it faced a catastrophic event, something powerful enough to collapse it completely, then its knowledge wouldn't just disappear instantly. It would fragment. Some would be lost. Some would survive. In altered forms. Stories. Symbols. Fragments of understanding. Passed down through generations. Until the original meaning fades. Becomes myth. Becomes legend. Becomes something we no longer take literally. And yet, those fragments might still carry truth. Distorted, but real. Which brings us back to the Sphinx. Because maybe it's not just a relic of a lost civilization. Maybe it's a bridge, a connection point between two worlds. One we remember, and one we've forgotten. And if that's the case, then the question is no longer just, how old is the Sphinx? But, what have we forgotten about ourselves? Because if we've done this before, if humanity has reached advanced levels of knowledge, and then lost them, take a moment and imagine the future. Not tomorrow, not next year, but thousands of years from now. Imagine everything we've built. Cities of glass and steel. Satellites orbiting the planet. Digital networks carrying almost all human knowledge. Now imagine it all. Gone. Not gradually. Not preserved. But erased. Because here's something we rarely think about. Our civilization is fragile. Much more fragile than we like to believe. Remove maintenance, and within decades, buildings begin to fail. Within centuries, most of our structures collapse. Within a few thousand years, almost nothing remains. Digital data? Gone in decades. Books? Dust? Metal? Corroded. Even concrete breaks down faster than ancient stone. So what would survive? Not much. But maybe a few things. Things carved into mountains, into bedrock. Structures too large, too integrated with the earth, to disappear completely. And even then, they wouldn't remain intact. They would erode, break, shift, lose detail, lose context. Future generations, if they found them, wouldn't see them as we do. They would see fragments, mysteries, anomalies, just like we do now. Now bring that back to the Sphinx, a massive structure, carved directly into the earth, designed to endure, aligned with the sky, exposed to the elements. And still here, after thousands, possibly tens of thousands of years. If anything from a lost civilization could survive, it would look exactly like this. Which means the Sphinx might not be an exception. It might be a clue, one of the few things that made it through. And that leads to something even more unsettling. Because if a civilization before us built something to last, something to be found, then maybe they expected to be forgotten. Think about that. They didn't build something temporary. They didn't leave fragile records. They built something that could survive collapse, which suggests they understood that collapse was possible, maybe even inevitable. And if that's true, then the Sphinx is not just a message of existence. It's a message of awareness, a recognition that time will erase almost everything, and that only certain things can survive it. Now ask yourself, if we knew, with certainty, that our civilization would one day disappear, what would we leave behind? What would we build? To speak for us? To people living thousands of years in the future? Would we do anything differently? Would we build for longevity instead of speed? Would we think in centuries instead of years? Or would we do exactly what we're doing now, assuming it will last? Because that might be the biggest difference. Not technology, not intelligence, but perspective. A civilization that thinks in cycles builds differently than one that thinks in straight lines. And maybe that's what we're seeing. Not just a difference in time, but a difference in mindset. Because the Sphinx doesn't feel temporary. It doesn't feel like something built for one lifetime. It feels deliberate, patient, enduring, like something meant to outlive its creators. And maybe it already has, by a very long time. So what exactly are we looking at? A monument, a relic, a coincidence of natural processes and human imagination, or something else entirely? Because at this point, the question is no longer about one piece of evidence. It's about the weight of all of them combined. 6 different lines of inquiry, all pointing in the same direction, not proving, but suggesting, strongly, persistently, that something doesn't fit. And when enough things don't fit, you don't just adjust the details. You question the entire framework. Let's strip it down. If the Sphinx shows signs of water erosion, then it must have existed during a wet climate. If that climate ended thousands of years before Egypt, then the Sphinx predates Egypt. If its alignment points to the age of Leo, then its design references a sky from 10,000 plus years ago. If its head appears recarved, then what we see today is not the original form. If the surrounding structures use older, weathered stone, then they may have reused something already ancient. If no records exist of its construction, then the civilization that built it may not be the one that documented everything else. Each step, on its own, can be debated, but together, they form a chain, and breaking that chain requires explaining every link, not just one. Now here's where it becomes uncomfortable, Because there are only two real possibilities. Either all of this is coincidence, a series of unrelated anomalies that just happen to align in a way that suggests great antiquity, or they are connected. And if they are connected, then the Sphinx is not what we think it is, and history is not what we think it is. Now pause here, because this is the moment where most people instinctively pull back, where the mind says, that's too much. There must be another explanation. And maybe there is. Skepticism is important. It protects us from false conclusions. But it can also do something else. It can protect us from uncomfortable truths. So instead of rejecting the idea outright, let's ask a different question. What would need to be true for all of this to make sense? Not what is proven, not what is accepted, but what is required. Because sometimes, the best way to understand a mystery is to follow it to its logical conclusion, even if that conclusion feels impossible. Because if the Sphinx is truly older, if it comes from a time before recorded history, then everything we've explored points toward one unavoidable idea, that there was a chapter of human history we don't remember. Not because it didn't happen, but because it was lost. And now, we're standing in front of one of the only pieces of evidence that survived it. Still here, still watching, still asking the same silent question after thousands of years. And we're finally starting to hear it. And now, we arrive at the edge of the question. Not the comfortable part. Not the part that fits neatly into books or lectures. But the part where everything we've explored starts pointing somewhere deeper. Because if the Sphinx is older, then it doesn't just change a date. It changes the starting point of civilization itself. And that has consequences. Serious ones. Because history, as we understand it, is built like a structure. Layer by layer. Assumption on top of assumption. Evidence interpreted through frameworks that have been reinforced for generations. But what happens when one of the foundational pieces is wrong? You don't just fix that one piece. You have to reconsider everything built on top of it. And that's exactly why ideas like this are resisted. Not because they're impossible, but because they're disruptive. Because if the Sphinx predates ancient Egypt, then Egypt is not the beginning. It's a continuation. And if Egypt is a continuation, then something came before it. Something capable, something organized, something advanced enough to leave behind a structure that still challenges us today. And here's where it becomes even more unsettling. Because once you accept that possibility, you can't limit it to one monument. You have to ask, where else might the evidence be? Buried beneath sand, submerged under oceans, hidden in places we haven't fully explored. Or worse, already discovered, but misunderstood. Because think about how we interpret the past. We don't just look at evidence. We interpret it through expectations. We assign dates based on context. We assume builders based on proximity. We connect things that seem related because they fit the narrative. But if the narrative itself is incomplete, then those connections might be wrong. And that means some of the things we think we understand might not be what they seem. Now consider this. What if ancient Egypt itself didn't fully understand the Sphinx? What if they inherited it, respected it, reinterpreted it, but never truly knew its origin? That would explain the silence, the lack of records, the mythological language. Because when you encounter something ancient, something beyond your own history, you don't describe it as engineering. You describe it as divine, as something created by gods, because that's the only framework you have. And maybe that's exactly what happened. The Sphinx wasn't built as part of Egyptian civilization. It was adopted into it, integrated, given meaning, but not created by it. And over time, that meaning replaced the truth. Because that's what humans do. We explain what we don't understand. We fill gaps with stories. We turn mystery into mythology. And eventually, we forget that it was ever a mystery at all, until something forces us to look again, to question, to doubt, to see the cracks in what we thought was solid. And that's where we are now, standing between two possibilities. One, that everything fits, that the Sphinx is exactly what we've been told, a monument built by a known civilization, at a known time, for known reasons. And the other, that it doesn't, that it's older, stranger, more complex, a remnant of something we've only just begun to rediscover. Both possibilities exist, but only one of them explains all the evidence, and the more you think about it, the more difficult it becomes to ignore which one that is. So where does that leave us? Not with certainty, not with a final answer, but with something far more powerful. A shift. Because once you begin to question something this fundamental, you don't just stop at one monument. You start seeing patterns elsewhere. You start asking different questions, looking at familiar things in unfamiliar ways. Because the Sphinx might not be unique. It might just be the most visible, the most obvious, the one that survived in plain sight, while everything else was buried, lost, or ignored. Think about how much of the Earth we haven't explored properly. Deserts, dense jungles, ocean floors, entire landscapes that could hide structures, eroded, collapsed, or simply overlooked. And even in places we have explored, how much have we truly understood? Or have we just labeled things quickly, placed them into categories, and moved on? Because if a lost civilization existed, we wouldn't necessarily recognize its work immediately. We would interpret it through what we already know. We would assign it to known cultures, known timelines, even if it doesn't fully fit. Especially if it doesn't fully fit. Because the alternative is more difficult. It requires rewriting, relearning, letting go of certainty. And that's not something institutions do easily. But individuals can. Which brings this back to you. Because at the end of all this, after the erosion, the stars, the structures, the myths, the silence, there is one final step. Not in the evidence, but in interpretation. Because the Sphinx doesn't give answers. It never has. It presents a question, a silent one. One that has lasted longer than any written record. And now, you've seen the pieces. Not all of them, but enough to understand the shape of the puzzle. So what do you do with that? Do you accept the official version because it's stable, structured, widely agreed upon? Or do you allow for the possibility that something much older, much more complex, is hidden just beneath the surface of what we think we know? There's no requirement to decide. Not immediately. Because the value isn't in choosing a side. It's in staying aware, in noticing where things don't quite fit, in being willing to sit with the question. Because history is not fixed. It evolves. It changes. As new evidence appears. As old assumptions are challenged. And sometimes, the biggest discoveries don't come from new data. They come from looking at existing data differently. So maybe the Sphinx doesn't need to be explained. Maybe it needs to be listened to. Not literally, but carefully, patiently, without forcing it to fit into what we already believe. Because whatever it is, whoever built it, whenever it was created, it has already done something extraordinary. It has survived long enough to make you question, and that alone might be the most important part of all. And maybe that's where the real story begins. Not in the past, but in what we choose to do with it. Because every generation inherits a version of history, a framework, a set of explanations that feel complete, until they don't. And when something like the Sphinx challenges that framework, we have two choices: ignore it or follow it. Not blindly, not irrationally, but honestly. Because the truth is, we don't need all the answers to recognize a pattern. We just need enough pieces to know that something is missing. And that's exactly where we are now. Standing in front of a monument that doesn't fully belong to the story we've been told. A structure that fits, but not perfectly. That aligns, but not completely. That exists, but without a clear origin. And those are the kinds of things that change history. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly. As more people begin to notice, as more questions are asked, as more connections are made. Because this isn't about proving one theory. It's about expanding the space of possibility, allowing for the idea that human history might be deeper than we've been taught. That knowledge might have been gained, lost, and gained again. That we are not standing at the peak, but somewhere along a repeating path. And if that's true, then the Sphinx is not just a relic of the past. It's a reference point, a marker along that path, a reminder that we've been here before. Not exactly like this, not with the same tools, not with the same world, but with the same potential, the same curiosity, the same drive to understand, and to build something that lasts. Now imagine, thousands of years from now, someone standing where you are, looking at the remains of our world, trying to understand who we were, what we knew, what we believed. They won't have our full story. They'll have fragments, structures, patterns, just like we do. And they will ask the same questions. Who built this? When? Why? And they might get it wrong. They might assume things that aren't true. They might miss the bigger picture, just like we might be doing now. Because that's part of being human. We interpret. We reconstruct. We try to make sense of incomplete information. And sometimes, we get close. And sometimes, we don't. But every once in a while, something breaks through. A detail, a pattern, a realization. That shifts everything. And maybe, for you, this is one of those moments. Not because you now know the truth, but because you see the possibility that the truth might be different, And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The Sphinx doesn't need to move. It doesn't need to speak. It doesn't need to reveal anything new. It's already done its job. It's still here. And that's enough. Because survival is the strongest signal of all. It means something was important enough to last. And now, it's up to us to decide what that means. And now, we reach a quiet place, not the end, but something close to understanding. Because after everything we've explored, there's one final layer left. Not evidence, not theory, but perspective. Because the way we look at the Sphinx changes what it becomes. If you see it as a monument, you look for a builder, a date, a purpose tied to a known culture. If you see it as a mystery, you look for anomalies, for inconsistencies, for gaps in the narrative. But if you see it as something else, something that exists outside those categories, then a different question appears. Not who built it, not when, but what does it represent? Because maybe the Sphinx is not meant to be solved like a problem. Maybe it's meant to be experienced like a signal. Something that exists across time, connecting different eras, different civilizations, different ways of thinking. A fixed point in a moving world. Think about how long it has been there. Not decades, not centuries, but possibly 10,000 years or more. That's longer than recorded history. Longer than languages. Longer than most human memory. And yet, it remains. Facing the same direction. Watching the same horizon. As if waiting. Now consider this. Everything we've discussed. The erosion, the stars, the structure, the silence. All of it points to one idea. Not certainty, but possibility. The possibility that human history is deeper, older, more complex than we've allowed ourselves to believe. And that's not something to fear. It's something to explore, because it means there is more to discover, more to understand, more to uncover, not just about the past, but about ourselves. Because if civilizations can rise, fall, be forgotten, and still leave something behind, then we are part of that same pattern, not separate from it, not above it, inside it. And that changes how you see everything. It shifts your sense of time, of progress, of permanence. Because suddenly, what feels stable becomes temporary, and what feels distant becomes relevant. The past is not gone. It's layered beneath us. And sometimes, it surfaces, in stone, in patterns, in questions that refuse to go away. The Sphinx is one of those questions. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't require agreement. It simply exists. And by existing, it challenges. Quietly. Patiently. Without force. And maybe that's why it's still here. Because it doesn't try to convince. It just waits. For those who are willing to look a little deeper. To think a little longer. To sit with uncertainty. Without needing immediate answers. Because that's where real understanding begins. Not in certainty, but in curiosity. And if you've made it this far, then you're already part of that process. You've already stepped outside the surface and into something deeper. And that alone changes how you see the world. But there's one last step. One final thought. Before we let all of this go. Before we return to silence. So before you close your eyes, before this fades into the quiet background of thought, there is one final question. Not about the Sphinx, not about Egypt, not even about the past, but about you. Because everything we've explored only matters for one reason. It changes how you see reality, not in a dramatic way, not instantly, but subtly, like a shift in perspective that you can't fully reverse. Because once you allow the possibility, that history is incomplete. That knowledge can be lost. That civilizations can rise and disappear. Then something else becomes clear. We are not as permanent as we think, and neither is anything we build. But that doesn't make it meaningless. In fact, it makes it more meaningful, because it means what we choose to create, what we choose to preserve, what we choose to pass on actually matters. The Sphinx may be ancient, it may be a message, or it may simply be a survivor. But either way, it did something extraordinary. It endured through climate shifts, through sandstorms, through entire civilizations rising and falling around it. It remained. And now, you've seen it differently. Not just as a statue, but as a question, as a possibility, as a quiet reminder. That time is deeper than we imagine, and that we are only a small part of it. Now, imagine again, that distant future, thousands of years from now. Someone standing where you are, looking at what remains of our world, trying to understand us. They won't have everything. They'll have fragments, just like we do. And they will wonder. They will question. They will try to piece it together. And maybe they'll get it wrong. Or maybe they'll get closer than we did. Because that's how this works. Each generation, getting a little closer, seeing a little more, understanding a little deeper. And maybe that's the real purpose. Not to give answers, but to keep the question alive. Across time, across civilizations, across everything that changes. Because as long as the question exists, so does the search. And as long as the search continues, something is never truly lost. So now, let your mind slow down. Let the question settle. You don't need to solve anything tonight. You don't need to decide what's true. Just let the possibility exist. Somewhere in the background. Quiet. Unresolved. Waiting. Just like the Sphinx. Still facing the horizon. Still watching the sunrise. Still here. And maybe that's enough. And now, everything is quiet. No more evidence to introduce. No more arguments to build. Just a single image, holding everything together. The Sphinx. Still there. Still facing east. Still watching the horizon, as it has for thousands of years. Maybe longer. By now, you've seen the pieces. Not as isolated ideas, but as parts of something larger. The erosion that shouldn't exist. The climate that no longer exists. The stars that no longer align the same way. The structure that doesn't quite match its own head. The stones that seem older than the buildings they belong to. The silence, where there should be records. The stories that refuse to disappear. Individually, each one can be dismissed, explained, debated. But together, they create something harder to ignore. A shift, not in facts, but in perspective. Because maybe the question was never meant to be answered quickly. Maybe it was meant to linger, to stay with you, to slowly reshape how you think about time, about history, about what it means to be part of a civilization. Because if the Sphinx is older, then time is deeper. If time is deeper, then history is incomplete. And if history is incomplete, then we are still discovering who we are. Not just where we came from, but what we're capable of. Because somewhere in the distant past, whether we understand it or not, something existed. That could create something like this. And that means the potential has always been there. It didn't begin with us, and it won't end with us. We are part of something ongoing, something much larger than any single era, any single culture, any single explanation. And that realization is both unsettling and strangely calming. Because it means we are not alone in time. Others came before. Others may come after. And the things we leave behind might one day be questions too. Just like this one. So don't rush to an answer. Don't force a conclusion. Let the mystery exist. Let it stay open. Because not all questions are meant to be closed. Some are meant to be carried, thought about, returned to, seen differently over time. And maybe, years from now, you'll remember this. Not the details, not every argument, but the feeling. That moment when something familiar stopped feeling certain and became something else, something deeper, something unresolved. And that's where real curiosity begins. Not in knowing, but in wondering. And now, there is only one thing left. To let it go. Slowly. Quietly. Like the end of a long thought. Fading into stillness. And now, there is nothing left to prove. No final revelation. No hidden chamber opening. No voice from the past explaining everything. Just silence. And the image of something that has been here. Long before us. And will likely remain. Long after. The Sphinx. Not moving. Not changing. Not explaining. Just existing. And maybe that's the point. Because in a world where everything changes, where information moves faster than we can process, where answers are expected instantly, there is something powerful about a question that refuses to be answered. Something that doesn't adapt to us, but waits for us to adapt to it. And maybe that's what this has always been. Not a puzzle to solve, but a perspective to grow into. Because the deeper you look, the less certain things become. And that's not a flaw. It's an invitation to think differently, to see beyond Pravichny Ramke, to accept that not everything is known, and not everything needs to be. The Sphinx doesn't demand belief. It doesn't require agreement. It simply remains, as it always has, facing the horizon, watching the light return, again, and again, and again. And maybe that's the only answer it offers. That time moves in cycles, that endings become beginnings, that what is lost is not always gone forever, just waiting to be rediscovered. So now, let your thoughts slow down. Let the questions fade into the background. You don't need to hold on to them. You don't need to solve them. Just let them exist, like distant echoes, soft, unresolved, calm. If this journey made you see the world a little differently, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Leave a like if something here stayed with you, and write in the comments what you think. Not what you were told, but what you feel. And now, rest. Imagine the first light of dawn, touching ancient stone, a horizon that hasn't changed, For thousands of years, the quiet breath of the desert, the stillness, the weight of time, settling gently around you. You're not rushing. You're not searching. You're just here. And somewhere in that silence, the question remains, unanswered, but alive. Good night. Then everything we assume about our uniqueness, our progress, our place in time, becomes uncertain. And uncertainty is where discovery begins, but also where discomfort lives. Because the idea that we are not the first, that others came before us and disappeared, leaves us with one final question. Not about the past, but about the future. Are we any different?